few years ago, I attended an orchid show and I met a couple who were just phenomenal at growing Cattleya orchids. So I started talking to them and asking them how they became so successful at growing these gorgeous Cattleya orchids. And they told me that once they started getting into orchids, they just started reading everything they could get their hands on to help them to grow orchids. That just really resonated with me because that's exactly what I've done. Everything I can get my hands on about orchids, I read it. And I want to share with you my top 10 must-have books to grow orchids. I'm going to start out with this one right here, and it's put out by the American Orchid Society, called Orchids and Their Culture by Mary E. Garriston and Ron Parsons. And it's really the first 75 pages of this book that I found to be the most helpful. And it's kind of like an orchid care Q&A. So a question that you might have, then they answer it. And it's been a really helpful book about orchids. The second one I feel like is kind of a unique book, not your typical how to grow orchids. Of course, it does talk about specific orchids and their care, but it does something that's a little bit different. It talks about projects, designs, arrangements that you can make with orchids. So it has terrariums and wreaths and just different things that you might not expect to be able to make with your orchids. It also talks a lot about jewel orchids, and that's also kind of an uncommon orchid to grow. A lot of orchid books don't really go into a lot of depth about jewel orchids, but this book does. The next book is called Bloom Again Orchids by Judy White, and I like this book because it goes into depth on easy to grow, easy to rebloom orchids, and then it gives really specific culture information so you can read through it and see if it's something that aligns with your care style in your growing environment. So I found this book really helpful, Bloom Again Orchids by Judy White. The next three are kind of a trio of books that I found really helpful, and they're all by the same author. Her name is Mary Noble, and she has You Can Grow Cattleya Orchids, You Can Grow Phalaenopsis Orchids, and You Can Grow Orchids. So together, these books are really helpful, and they go into a lot of depth, especially about Phalaenopsis and Cattleya orchids. She gives a lot of really good practical information, and they're really easy to read. The next two books are kind of like illustration books with really beautiful drawings and watercolors. So this is by Sandra Knapp, and I'll just show you one of the illustrations. It's something that you just want to put on your coffee table and just to be able to look at and enjoy the pictures. They're just phenomenal. Here's another one. This is really pretty. So if you want a book about orchids to put on your coffee table, recommend Extraordinary Orchids. Next one is also an illustrated book, and it was put together by a couple. It was Professor Oakes Ames and Blanche Ames, and it's called Orchids at Christmas. And it's because at Christmas time, she would illustrate an orchid, Blanche would, and then they would put a poem with it. And it's just kind of a love note to orchids and a love note to each other. So they did a lot of work collaboratively where Professor Oakes Ames would write scientific books about orchids and Blanche Ames would illustrate the books with her orchids. So just to show you one picture. There you can see it, and then there's a poem by William Wordsworth, and it's just a really fun, sweet, tender book that I've really enjoyed. Book number 9, I don't have a copy of this book, but I just checked it out at my library, and it's called The Orchid Thief by Susan Orlean, and it is just a really fun book. Susan is a journalist, and she went down to Florida and she started interviewing this man about he had stolen a bunch of ghost orchids, and she goes through his story and she talks about just kind of an obsession with orchids and lots of history about how people started getting into orchids, and she tells just a lot of really interesting background information that's not about orchid culture, orchid care. It's just about orchids and the people who have been obsessed with them. So really fun read. It's also been made into a movie. Haven't seen the movie, but really enjoyed the book. The last book that I recommend is called Understanding Orchids by William Colina, and this is kind of like your orchid Bible. It talks a lot about how to care for orchids, and then there's a really complete list of orchids and how to care for them. It has really helpful information like this is a really good orchid to grow in a greenhouse. This is a good windowsill orchid. This is a good orchid to grow under lights. And I've just found it to be a phenomenal, just really helpful, go-to, trustworthy guide for growing orchids. So I hope that at least one of these books stand out to you, that you'll want to go read and learn more about caring for orchids. If you want to get a list of these books, I'll have a link below that will go to my website, Orchid Bliss, and I'll have a complete list of all of these books. And of course, you are always welcome to join Orchid Buds, my online community where we talk about orchids and how to care for them, where I give personalized advice, and we just have a lot of fun growing orchids together.